So tonight we're going to talk about a different topic, the role of archives in cultural preservation. And we're happy to have Leon Miller with us tonight. He is the curator of the Louisiana Research Collection at Tulane. And Leon, who probably some of you have come in contact with in your research, or you know of him. He has an MA in history from the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville, and he started there as a manuscript processor after he got his degree, and then he went to Tulane and has been at Tulane for I believe since 1990. I think, is that correct? I think.
Long time.
So he's started off with the manuscripts at Tulane and has been the curator of the Louisiana Research Collection. And so we're happy to have him tonight. And he has a deep experience with archives and has been involved in a number of national associations of archivists. And we're happy to get his reflections tonight on the importance of archives. And so we want to welcome Leon to talk with us.
Stephen, thank you so much. I'd like to talk with you all about something that is absolutely essential for genealogists, and that's archives, along with libraries, museums, architectural preservation. Archives are one of the four pillars.
And let me start your presentation. We'll get.
Oh, yeah, of cultural preservation.
But you can keep talking. You can keep going. I'll just share the screen.
We all understand and use and appreciate the central, essential role that libraries play in the American way of life. We all enjoy museums. Most people understand the need to preserve historically important architecture, works, buildings, historically important works of engineering, the so-called built environment. But for most people, archives are a blank. Archives really aren't part of the public conversation. And that's what I want to talk with you all about tonight. The great historian of archives was Ernst Posner, and Posner argued that archives began more than 5,000 years ago in ancient Sumer, when the Sumerians built storage facilities for housing clay tablets that recorded land transactions and business transactions. Storage facilities, clay tablets, business transactions, land records. Storage facilities and clay tablets are an example of how the word archive really has two meanings. The first meaning is a building, a structure for housing archives. I'm going to the archives, I'm going to the building, I'm going to the structure to do archival research. But the second meaning is a grouping of archival documents themselves. I'm going to the archives, the building, to do research in the archival collection, the papers created, say, of the League of Women Voters. Storage facilities, clay tablets, business transactions, land records. If storage facilities and clay tablets are examples of how the word archives has two meanings, business transactions and land records are examples of obligations and rights. Stephen buys 3 bushels of corn from me, pays me 13 shekels for them. I later say, Stephen, you owe me money, you never paid me. Stephen goes to the archives, pulls out the clay tablet that proves he paid me, and he's fine. Stephen might own some farmland. I say, no, I own that farmland. Stephen goes to the archives, pulls out the clay tablet with the deed, and proves that that land is his. So from the very beginning, archives serve to protect people. Archives serve to protect people's property. Archives serve to protect people's liberty in a very real sense. No, Stephen did not steal that land from me. He got that land legally and therefore does not deserve to go to prison. Archives, in a very real, literal sense, protect people's freedom. When I say archival document, what do I mean? Archivists today would say that any document that has enduring value and therefore should be preserved permanently is archival. In other words, an archival document is any document that should be kept forever. The vast majority of documents that we create, grocery lists, emails, canceled checks, do not have permanent value. We file tax returns, and after 7 years, we shred those tax returns. So by definition, tax returns are not archival. But if a document is one of that tiny fraction of documents that has permanent value, if it documents something significant about our culture, if it documents laws, if it documents rights, if it records land transactions, for example, going back to the founding of the colony, that is archival and deserves archival care. After Sumer, the ancient Chinese, Greeks, and Romans all had well-developed archives. Archives were created in Britain after the Norman Conquest in 1066. This is an example of how archival manuals of administration were being published in Europe in the 1600s, this one being published in Venice in 1632. But modern archival thinking begins with the French Revolution. French government records were typically stored in various offices around the country. The foreign affairs records were stored in the office of the foreign ministry. The treasurer's records were stored in the office of the treasury. What the French revolutionaries did was go from office to office and gather the records and bring them together into one place, the French National Archives, the world's oldest and still the largest national archives. But what the French revolutionaries did next was even more important because they threw open the doors of the National Archives. For the first time, the people had the right to inspect their government's records. The people could see where their tax money was going. The people could determine if officials were corrupt. They could learn whether the government was obeying its own laws. They could determine if the government was respecting and protecting their rights. So with the French Revolution, archives became essential for protecting people from government tyranny. Archives became essential for holding government accountable. Archives became essential for protecting freedoms, and today, archives are essential for maintaining a democratic society. That's the old French National Archives. It's a museum today. If you go to Paris to do research, you'll go to the new French Archives here. So the French archival tradition focused on governmental records, free and open access, and protecting individual rights. I say French archival tradition because every nation approaches archives in a slightly different way. If the French archival tradition began with the French Revolution, the American archival tradition began a little later, was very different, and occurred in two waves. The first wave took place 20 or 30 years after the American Revolution. Soldiers who fought in the American Revolution were aging and dying, and with them, their memories at that time were being lost. The founding fathers were dying, and with them, a connection to the past. There was sort of a generalized fear that if something weren't done, America's collective memory of its founding would be lost. Therefore, organizations were created to collect and preserve the papers of the founding fathers. Note these were not state records. Instead, they were the personal papers of VIPs, men, and they were all men, considered historically important. And they were collected often not by state archives, but by wealthy private collectors and private historical societies. Organizations such as the Massachusetts Historical Society, founded in 1791, and the oldest historical society in America. These organizations were founded by wealthy men who often contributed their own private personal collections of personal papers to these kinds of organizations. So what do I mean when I say they collected personal papers? By personal papers, I mean not government records, but instead the kinds of documents we all create every day, just as a normal part of living our daily lives. We might write letters, we might write email, we certainly all pay bills. Just as a normal part of leading our daily lives, we leave behind us a paper trail, or more commonly today, an electronic documents trail that records what we were like, what the time was like when we were alive, what the social folkways and mores were when we were alive. For example, a social folkway we have today is that when someone gives you a gift, you write them a thank you note. And so in 1683, when Charles II gave William Penn, Pennsylvania, William Penn wrote Charles II a thank you note. Great and gracious Prince, it is a barren soil that yields no return to the dew that feeds it, and they are mean and ungrateful knaves that are oblivious of the favors they have received. that the king then graciously pledged to accept my most humble thanks for his many royal favors conferred upon me, more especially this. William Penn misspelled Pennsylvania, but it was his colony and he could spell it however he wanted to. William Penn didn't write this because he wanted it preserved in archives. He didn't write it so students could come to Tulane 340 years later to see it. He wrote it because it was a normal part of conducting his business affairs. It was a normal part of living his daily life. Someone gives you a colony, you write them a thank you note. This is what I mean when I say Americans collected personal papers of the founding fathers, non-governmental personal papers such as personal correspondence, diaries, personal business files, and on and on. Again, these went into the private collections of private individuals and private historical societies, not state archives, not national archives, not public archives, but private archives. And it was during this time that we get the first great wave of American state historical societies. And so unlike in France, where the French archival tradition focused on state records, good government, and citizen rights, the American archival tradition began with personal papers, collecting non-governmental records, and memorializing great men. A slightly old-fashioned term for personal papers is manuscripts, which is why this is sometimes called the American manuscript tradition. If the first great wave of American archival development occurred 20 or 30 years after the American Revolution, the second great wave occurred 20 or 30 years after the American Civil War. In the South, Reconstruction was ending, and the so-called myth of the lost cause was metastasizing. Elite white Southerners expressed a need to memorialize the Confederate dead, but it was really much more than that, because by portraying as heroes people who had fought for the right to buy and sell human beings, the Southern elite, drawn largely from the old plantation ruling class, was seeking to disenfranchise the Black population and return to power. But to return to power, they had to make themselves appear respectable. So they strove to minimize the horrors of slavery. They emphasized individual Confederate heroism, and they created archives to propagandize the narrative that slavery was benign and the South was fighting for a just cause, the cause of states' rights, or the cause of individual liberty, or the cause of maintaining their own economic system, or the cause of this or that, anything other than the simple fact that the South fought for the right to buy and sell people. As in the East and Northeast after the American Revolution, this new wave of Southern archives often involved the creation of historical societies that collected the papers of prominent Confederate men. The Louisiana Historical Association was founded in 1889, and the Mississippi Historical Society was founded in 1890. These kinds of, again, private historical societies would collect all kinds of papers, diaries, maps, and more about the Confederacy. The Louisiana Historical Association amassed a large collection of Confederate documents, including the personal papers of very prominent Confederate leaders, which we now preserve at the Tulane University Library. Where are the papers of Jefferson Davis? At the Tulane University Library. Where are the Gettysburg letters of Robert E. Lee? At the Tulane University Library. Where are the papers of Stonewall Jackson? Yesterday, God crowned our arms off to his wife after the Battle of McDowell in May of 1862, just to let her know that he was okay. But I also use this as an example with students of how archival documents are often just as important for what they don't say. He never asks how she's doing. Nowhere does he say, I love you. He doesn't even close by saying, love Tom, and instead signs his full name in the exact same form that he signed military orders. And as you can see in the lower left, it cost her $2 because he sent it collect. In addition to prominent men, we also preserve letters and diaries of scores of Confederate soldiers, as well as a large collection of letters and diaries of Union soldiers serving in Louisiana. Now, we put all the Union letters and diaries online. Why? Why would we put the Union letters and diaries online, letters of Union soldiers serving in Louisiana, and not the Confederate letters and diaries online?
They don't let down their descendants.
That's it. You're the first one who's ever gotten that right. That's exactly it. Louisiana Confederate soldiers served mostly outside the state, primarily in Tennessee and Virginia. And their letters and diaries are invaluable for finding out what's happening in Tennessee and Virginia. But we're the Louisiana Research Collection. We want people to study what's happening in Louisiana. And to learn what's happening in Louisiana during the Civil War, you go to the letters and diaries of Union soldiers who were serving in our state during that time. Following the creation of Southern historical societies, there was a wave of Southern state archives being created. The Alabama State Archives was founded in 1901, the Mississippi Archives in 1902, Arkansas in 1905. So the European archival tradition emphasized government records and good government. The American archival tradition emphasized personal papers and so-called great men. But in both cases, the archives were created with intention, with a purpose, with specific goals that people wanted to accomplish. That is, more often than not, archives are created to promote an agenda. And you can glean that agenda by the kinds of materials they chose to collect and preserve. In France, their agenda was to hold government accountable and protect individual rights. In America, their agenda was to glorify the great men and stories of the American Revolution. In the South, their agenda was to minimize the horrors of slavery, distract from the real cause of the Civil War, and pave the way for the resumption of power by the Southern plantation aristocracy. That is, archives are not neutral. Archives are never neutral. They can't be neutral because, like everything else, they reflect the people who created them. Because of this kind of thing, the idea of creating a United States National Archives was slow to develop. Okay. Congress had actually passed the Records Act in 1789, which gave responsibility for the national government's record to the Secretary of State, but that was really kind of a peripheral part of his job and didn't show much interest. Now, like in France before the French Revolution, US government records were maintained in their office of origin. That is, each federal agency maintained its own records, but there was no mandate for preservation. There was no requirement for public access. So patent records, for example, were kept in the patent office, but the patent office suffered a devastating fire in 1836, and it suffered a second major fire in 1877, destroying untold numbers of patent records and models. That finally shocked officials into jump-starting discussions about creating a centralized, professional United States National Archives, a national archives with strict uniform preservation standards, fireproofing, and a national archives committed to public access. There were various proposals, a couple of wars intervened. It took almost 50 years, but finally Congress authorized it in 1926. Various designs and locations were considered. Construction began in 1931. And the United States National Archives was founded and opened its doors in 1934, when Franklin Roosevelt signed into law the National Archives Act. The building included symptoms that were of the art for 1934, protection from flooding and fire, special security systems, specialized air handling systems, and the National Archives Act established the National Archives as an independent agency charged with collecting, preserving, and providing access to America's government records. The new archives building was specifically designed to welcome the public, and the fact that the U.S. National Archives was created as an independent agency with the United States National Archivist appointed by the President himself is especially important. Just as it's vital for libraries to be independent, so you can't have people dictating to you what you can or cannot read, so government archives must be independent. So politicians can't control which records to destroy, which government records to preserve, and which government records you as a citizen can see. Tulane University's archival program began on May 3rd, 1889. It's very unusual for an archive to know when and what its first acquisition was, but we do. It was donated by Mrs. L. DeLon, and it was this, a letter from Thomas Jefferson to Armand Duplanche here in New Orleans. Monticello, September 24th, 1808. And a letter which I wrote the last year to Monsieur de la Viette. I advised him to negotiate a loan in Europe to the amount of his debts funded on the hypothecation of his lands in Orleans, repaid by annual sales of the lots of the land adjoining New Orleans. So Thomas Jefferson was writing to Duplanche here in New Orleans about their mutual friend, the Marquis de Lafayette. Lafayette had a complicated life after the American Revolution, but suffice it to say, for the French Revolution, he was rich. After the French Revolution, he was poor. Lafayette had invested in land in New Orleans, but was deeply in debt. And so Jefferson proposed a way to help their mutual friend get out of debt by selling some of his land in New Orleans. Problem: Lafayette's New Orleans land was underwater. Here, okay. Understanding that much of the lands adjoining the city were covered with water, but very shallow, I recommended surrounding part with a ditch and dike sufficient to reclaim it, an operation with which we are very familiar here and of little expense. From the shallowness of the water, I conjectured that a common ditch 3 feet deep and wide would draw off the water, and with the earth that came out of it, form a dike which would keep out the surrounding water. So here's Thomas Jefferson, the president, the statesman, the diplomat, the scientist, the farmer, the inventor, using a scientist's way, a farmer's way, an inventor's way, to try to help his friend Lafayette drain his land in New Orleans and get out of debt. It's a wonderful thing for any archive to have as its first acquisition. And since that first acquisition, we've acquired something along the lines of 6 linear miles of books and documents about our city and state. Of course, we can't acquire every piece of paper created in New Orleans, and so we have to specialize. Tulane began as a medical school, we specialize in medicine. Tulane has a nationally recognized law school, so we specialize in law. Tulane is a distinguished business school, so we specialize in business. We also specialize in Louisiana literature. We recently acquired the papers of Anne Rice, and every few months we have a request from a researcher who says, I'm allergic to the sun. Can I see the Anne Rice papers at night? One of our more heavily used literary collections is the papers of John Kennedy Toole, who wrote Confederacy of Dunces. This is his Pulitzer Prize, and the Toole papers have been so heavily used that we've put the entire John Kennedy Toole papers online, freely available to everyone. This is Louisiana, so we have to specialize in politics. We preserve the papers of dozens of New Orleans mayors, Louisiana governors, members of Congress, including Lindy Boggs, Hale Boggs, Edward Hebert, David Treen, Chet Morrison, Bob Livingston, David Bitter. Our reading room is named for Mayor Vixquiro, and we just acquired the papers of former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, who was a Tulane graduate. A couple of years ago, we acquired the most important cache of Huey P. Long documents discovered in the last 40 years. That gift included this, Long's personal copy of the engineer's drawing of the Huey P. Long Bridge. Many people assume that the bridge was named in Long's honor after his assassination. And you can see barely that it just says Bridge over the Mississippi. But this was Long's personal copy of the drawing. And in front of that, he wrote his own name. This is his handwriting, making it the Huey P. Long Bridge. In other words, this is the first written evidence that Long always intended to name that bridge after himself. We're also famous for our carnival collection, which includes more than 6,000 original carnival and float designs from the golden age of carnival, that is from before World War II. This is a costume design from the 1914 Proteus Parade. It's full of life and color, and it's just a lovely little work of art, but it's also a working design because you can see the holes where the costumier in Paris tacked it to a board to refer to while making the costume. While many of these costume designs are just, again, full of life, full of color, one of my personal favorites is this little guy who's monochrome. He's just green. He's dressed all in green with green arms and legs, green face paint, even green hair. And he looks very worried. What is he, and what's he so upset about? Well, he's one of 5 green peas in a pea pod being attacked by giant killer caterpillars. There's one going straight at him in the front, and he's recoiling back from this thing. The float design, again, is also a working drawing. You might be able to see the lines on the X and Y axis that tell us it was 21 feet long and 19 feet high. People talk about things being as alike as peas in a pea pod, but know how each pea is completely different. Each has its own costume, its own color scheme, different wings, different body types, different faces and facial expressions. So the designer was making each costume a unique character. The parade had 101 riders, so the designer created not only 101 different costumes, but 101 different characters for each rider to perform. That's a level of creativity we can hardly imagine today. Again, we have more than 6,000 of these original float and costume designs from before World War II, making it the largest collection in the world of Golden Age costume and float designs. And we've put them all online, freely available to everyone. It's almost impossible to list our special strengths. We preserve more archival materials pertaining to women than all other archives in the city combined. We preserve more LGBTQ materials than most other archives in town. We preserved one of the largest collections in the South pertaining to the area's Jewish community. Something we don't specialize in is genealogy. Academic libraries reflect their university programs, and Tulane doesn't have a major in genealogy. That doesn't mean we don't have things that might be useful to genealogists, but it does mean that genealogy is mostly a public library function. I'm going to talk about our resources, but first I want to mention that, as I'm sure most of you already know, the two great genealogical centers for our area are here, the East Bank Regional Library and the main branch of the New Orleans Public Library downtown. Both have not only outstanding genealogical resources, they also have specialists in genealogy who can help you. This is just part of the page of the East Bank Regional Library's website, and you can see that it offers a wealth of genealogy resources. I also want to especially point out the new genealogy page at the New Orleans Public Library. There. They also have extensive genealogical resources and are especially good at things like house histories, property histories, court records, and municipal records. As a university library, we do not acquire genealogical resources per se, and we don't have a genealogist on staff. That means that for genealogists, we're sort of a last resort. It's not that we won't have things you might be able to use, and it doesn't mean you won't be welcome. You'll be very welcome. But it does mean that to use our resources most effectively, you should exhaust the resources at the East Bank Regional Library and the New Orleans Public Library first. After you've done that, what might we have that could be useful? We may have, and it's not a guarantee, we may have personal papers for someone in the family you are researching. I mentioned that one of our specialties is politics. So if a Louisiana politician was in your family, it might be worth finding out if we have that politician's papers. Such papers will contain things like a politician's correspondence and office files that may or may not be useful to genealogical research. Very, very rarely, a collection of personal papers might contain a family genealogy, but again, that's fairly rare. I mentioned that we specialize in the New Orleans Jewish community, and as part of that, we are the official archives of most temples, synagogues, and congregations in the area. So you might want to look and say the Gates of Prayer records to see if their membership records, marriage records, or burial records mention an ancestor. Another of our specialties is social welfare, and we preserve the records of several area orphanages. So if you know a relative was in a particular orphanage, you might want to find out if we have that specific orphanage's records, so that you might be able to find out when they entered that orphanage and when they left. So how do you do that? How do you find out what we have? Since you all are researchers, I'm going to spend a little more time than I normally would with the details of how to use our resources. First, we're open by appointment only. Maybe that's too bad, but there are advantages to that for researchers that I'll mention in a moment. But first, before you make an appointment, you have homework to do. You need to find out if we have anything that you might want to see to determine if it will be worth your while to make an appointment. To find out what we have, you go to archives.tulane.edu. That one portal allows you to search the archival holdings of Tulane Special Collections, the Tulane Latin American Library, and the Newcomb College Archives. So you enter your search term here. And say you want to search for Stewart. You'll get 329 results. Some researchers want to look at all 329 of them, and that's fine. But say you're looking only for Stephen Stewart. You type Stephen in the box here to limit your results. And that will give you only the collections that contain Stewart and Stephen. And that narrows it down to 2 or 3 results. If the top one looks good, click on that blue title to learn more about it, and it takes you here. And if you decide you want to see this item, if you decide this item is relevant for your research and you want to request that we bring it out for you to see, then this is the most important page because it tells you what to ask for. You need to tell us that you want to see the Joseph S. Copes papers, LARC, LARC-733, box 9. That's what we need to bring something out for you. The name of the collection number, and the LARC is important. The name of the collection number, and the box number. So first, you research our holdings to see if we have anything relevant to your project. Second, you make a list of things you want to see with the name of the collection number, and the box number. We need the box number. You can't say you just want to see the Copes papers. The Copes papers are 67 boxes. Most of them won't apply to what your research topic is anyway. You need to narrow your search down to specific boxes. And once you have your list of collection names, collection numbers, and box numbers, then and only then, and third, do you make your appointment. The easiest way to make an appointment is to go to library.tulane.edu and click on Special Collections there. And that will take you to the Special Collections homepage. And you'll see Schedule an Appointment in the center of the page. Well, I wish this were a little more intuitive, but there are a few advantages to this system. You know if we have anything you can use before you arrive. You know that there will be a table reserved just for you. You know that you will have a block of time reserved just for you. And you know that your materials will be waiting for you when you arrive. Perhaps most importantly, parking at Tulane is difficult. We call it Jurassic parking. And with this system, you'll know if we have anything for you before you come to campus and try to find a parking space. That doesn't mean we try to be standoffish. We don't want to be standoffish at all. Once you arrive, we want you to feel comfortable and welcome. You're welcome to bring a laptop. You're welcome to take as many photos on your cell phone as you wish. You're welcome to use our easy-to-use self-service scanner. So we do need your support. There are many ways you can help. If you have a drawer of old Louisiana brochures, or if you have your grandmother's World War I letters, or if your church has old record books, please talk to us about how we can help permanently preserve those very valuable materials. We also work with organizations and clubs to be their official archives. That means the club works with us to make sure that we have a complete set of their records, their minutes, committee reports, financial reports, and newsletters. For their club, that means a complete set of their records will always be safe and always available to them. And that's a completely free service that we provide. For us, it means that we're able to give researchers access to that club's records. And for the researcher, that service is also completely free. Everything we do for researchers is free. You never pay a research fee. You don't have to buy a membership fee. You don't have to buy a library card. You can stand at our scanner all day and scan to your heart's content, and we'll never charge you one dime. But when we agree to preserve something, we agree to preserve it permanently. That is forever. And forever is expensive. We have to have special temperature controls, special humidity controls, special security systems. Normal file folders cost $7 a hundred, but we can't use normal file folders. We have to use archival quality, lictin-free, acid-neutral file folders that cost $70 per hundred. So just basic archival supplies are expensive. I mentioned earlier that we put John Kennedy Toole's papers online. The photograph is of Thelma Toole, John Kennedy Toole's mother. A friend of hers created the Thelma Toole Endowed Fund as a permanent memorial to her, and that fund allowed us to put her son's papers online. I mentioned that we've put more than 6,000 original Carnival float and costume designs online. That was made possible by the Pi Dufour Fund for Carnival. We depend on special funding for those kinds of special projects. And so if you might be interested in helping us in that way, please let me know. We also need your moral support. We're active on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. So please follow us on social media and keep up with what we're doing. Please let me sign you up for our email newsletter. If you know of a group that would like a speaker, I'm happy to talk to them. If you know a carnival collector or a collector of Louisiana documents, please let them know that we would like to talk with them. If you know of someone doing Louisiana research, let them know that we're here and that they are welcome to use our resources. So what do I want you to take away with you? 3 things. 1, Special Collections at the Tulane University Library preserves international cultural treasures. 2, we preserve international cultural treasures just so that we can make them available to everyone. And in a way, we hope that makes everyone feel comfortable and welcome. And 3, I'm an archivist. I'm proud to be an archivist. I think it's important work. I hope you all think it's important work, and that if you do, you'll help us however you can. All of you have certainly made me feel comfortable and grateful, and I'm very welcome. Thank you very much. Happy to take any questions, comments, threats, accusations?
I really don't have a question. I did visit Tulane archives, and I've been to probably over 100 archives and libraries. And it is, as you say, everyone was very welcoming. It's very clean. It was an easy process. I knew what I wanted. I just made a screenshot from my computer what I was looking for.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. It's really important just that people feel welcome. That they're, Tulane sometimes seems intimidating, and sometimes people think they're not welcome on campus. But with the kinds of things that we preserve, we are ethically obligated to make them available to everyone. We can't restrict them to just Tulane students. We can't restrict them to just Tulane faculty. We're ethically obligated as archivists to make international cultural treasures available to everyone on an equal basis. And so I appreciate that very much.
And also there was parking in a new and
Okay.
so
You didn't
that
get
was
a
my biggest concern was finding parking.
Okay.
But that turned out not to be a problem.
Anything else? Rita?
What are the qualifications to be architect, to do this kind of work?
Well, that's interesting. In America, I'm a certified archivist. To be a certified archivist, you have to have a master's degree, so many years of professional level working experience, you pass the exam. In America, most often, you become an archivist by going to library science school and taking a specialty track in archives. That's almost entirely unique to the United States. In almost every other country, in Canada, Great Britain, Australia, Germany, France, you get a master's in archives, a professional archival program. Only in the United States do you go through a library science school. Okay.
Just a bit on Thelma Toole. Thelma Toole had an elocution school.
Yes.
My wife took elocution from Thelma Toole.
Oh, how wonderful.
When my daughter was born in '79, Thelma gave my daughter his silver baby cup. So we have that at home.
Oh, that's so
And whenever my
special.
wife would talk to her, even on the phone, she'd straighten up right away. Oh, it was a character.
Well, that brings into question, do you maintain more than just papers, or are there other physical items that an archive?
An archive specialist specializes in documentation. A museum specializes in 3-dimensional objects or artifacts. And so we work with the Louisiana State Museum on that. If someone comes to us with artifacts, non-paper materials primarily, we'll refer them to the State Museum and call the State Museum and say, hey, this person called me, he's got great stuff, here's his number, get in touch with them. But we deal only with, in a way, deliberately recorded information. Now, you've got 2,000-year-old vase. Sure, that vase contains information, but you've got to study that vase and in a scholarly way, glean that information out of it. Archivists deal with information that you can just read. It almost always paper, but these days it's more and more electronic documents. One way I think of it is as things that are flat, paper, books, diaries, things like that. But an archivist is a specialist in deliberately recorded information that is unique. A librarian is a specialist in information that's been reproduced in quantity. You have one book, you've got 10,000, 50,000 copies of that book. And so if you lose that one book, it's not a great loss. There are 49,999 other copies of the book in the world. But archivists specialize in things that are unique. We don't have a copy of William Penn's letter. We have the original William's Penn letter. And if it's damaged or lost, it may be damaged or lost forever. That's why people all the time ask me, why aren't your materials online? Well, the fact that our materials are unique is why they're not online. You've got a library. Tulane Library's got more than 4 million books. It's one of the larger libraries actually in the world. To put the entire Tulane library, Tulane, however, only has to scan one book. And then it gets other libraries to scan one book. And after they've all scanned one book, they can pool those scans because they all have the same books. They can pool those scans. And scanning in a library, therefore, can go very fast. Another thing is you've got 50,000 copies of a book. You run that book through a scanner that can scan 100 pages a minute. The scanner tears out some pages, it destroys the binding, and chews the book up. Doesn't matter. You've got 49,000 other copies of that book out there. You just scan it again or get some other library's copy. With our materials, you can't run our materials through an automatic scanner. We teach students how to pull it out of the box carefully, how to handle it, how to lay it on the scanner, how to close the lid. And once they scan it, you can't just put it online. You've got to describe it in a way that makes sense to the researcher and that can let the researcher find it. We say for grant purposes, we can scan 4 to 6 documents per hour. So libraries very well might go mostly online during some of our lifetimes, but archives will never go online. Again, we've got 6 to 7 linear miles of materials. To scan everything in just my department, Louisiana Research Department, would take about 4,000 person years. So you will always have to go to the archives to do research.
In the Louisiana collection, do you have archives related to early settlements of towns and cities around?
We do, but our holdings before 1825 or so are quite weak. LSU Baton Rouge might have stronger holdings than that. The State Museum Louisiana Room has strong holdings in that, very strong holdings in that. Our holdings from before 1800 come primarily from wealthy private collectors who lived in New Orleans in the 20s and 30s. They worked primarily with dealers in New York, and they assembled just kind of random Louisiana documents. You have David Vitter's papers. And you've got a letter in the file folder and another letter behind that letter and another letter behind that letter. Well, the order of those letters tells you something. The first letter gives context to the second letter. The second letter gives context to the third letter. So 3 letters together literally contain more information. They contain more zeros and ones than the 3 letters separately contain because each letter sheds light on the other letters. Well, these New Orleans collectors would acquire or buy for a lot of money out of New York, just random documents. That's what we call an artificial collection. A collection where the items have no relation to each other, where the items have no context to each other. And we have some wonderful artificial collections from before 1800, and we put much of them online. But again, they're individual items. They're a little hard to use. You've got to be looking for something specific. And they're just in general difficult collections to use. So I would go online and look for, we have a pre-Civil War collection, materials mainly from before 1850, going back to about 1750, and see if it is anything you want people to use. We also have an outstanding map collection. Now we put most of our map collection online, and the map collection is invaluable for early settlements.
And the maps are primarily focused on the Southeast Louisiana, or are they kind of all over the state?
Well, the older the map gets, the broader its territory. So we have maps going back a long way. I can't think of our earliest map, but we've got 100 before 1800, I think 30 before 1700. My favorite map is a early 1500 map of Louisiana. It's the whole southeast coast, but over Louisiana it says cannibals be here. Anything else?
I guess, do any of our participants on Zoom, do you all have any questions? Amelie, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I recently read that the French Revolution destroyed many archives that came before them. That may be why it may be thought that they started the archives, that there were none before them because they destroyed them all.
That's a wonderful point. We have the archives of old families, the rich families, the nobility in France. Their archives going back 400 or 500, 600 years were stored in their estates, and those estates were just burned out. Those estates were looted, burned, documents scattered everywhere. So those documents from before the French Revolution were pretty much lost.
Very sad.
It really is. It really is.
So, the National Archives in Washington DC, is it similar as far as I need to know exactly what I'm looking for if I want to make an appointment there? I mean, I know they have the tourist part of it, you can just kind of go through, but if I'm doing some serious research, is it similar in making appointments and all that?
You know, I don't know. I do know that the National Archives used to be very, very good with email. And I always encourage people to send an email first, and they were always very good with email. I'm fairly certain that to do research there, you have to have an appointment, but I really can't guarantee it since the losses have been there.
And, you know, there was the big hullabaloo about between the vice president and former presidents, their own papers that were meant to be archived, I think, and, you know, got left in garages or whatever all the hullabaloo was. What do they do with that stuff? You know, they're gonna bring you 10, 20, 50 boxes of documents from President Trump's garage or whatever. Do they just look at all and scan it and keep it all and date it?
The Presidential Records Act declares that presidential papers belong to the American people. So for a president to take those records and try to keep them is a crime. And there are several things going on there. It's common for federal records, even classified records, to inadvertently be mixed up with someone's papers. I used to be in charge of Senator J. William Fulbright's papers, former chairman of the Formulations Committee. And sure, you would come across a classified document. You come across a classified document, you call the National Archives, and the National Archives sends a declassification officer, and he will look at it, and he will either declassify it on site, or he'll pack it up and take it back to DC with him. So that is routine. You expect that. The National Archives expects that. What if you don't cooperate with the National Archives? What if you say you're not going to give it back? What if you say you can declassify things using your brain? What if you refuse to answer a subpoena requiring you to give the documents back? If there is intent to, I'm not a lawyer at all, I'm not a lawyer, but if there is intent to break the law, that's a completely different issue. So The National Archives welcomes treating these things in a normal, routine manner. Yeah, you took it, it was in a firm, no problem, we'll just take it, don't worry about it, that happens all the time. But if you go out of your way to bug the National Archivist of the United States, he's obligated to go to the FBI, and it is a crime. It's aggravated by the fact that there were significant classified documents there. Classified documents are covered by 2 laws, one of which goes back to the Espionage Act of 1917. 10 to 20 years. So I'm not saying anyone's done that. I'm not saying anyone's guilty of that, but if they have done that, it can be a lot of time in jail. Now, there's the case of Sandy Berger, who was the national security advisor of Bill Clinton. And Berger was researching his memoirs, and he was in the National Archives. He was kind of annoyed at being told he had to leave, so he stuffed some papers at the end of closing and walked out with them. And you know, there are cameras everywhere in the National Archives, and they sort of search your bag when you leave, and he was immediately discovered and was arrested and had to go to trial for half a dozen documents in a pocket. Not a Mayflower van full of boxes of documents from the White House. He was prosecuted for a half dozen documents in his pocket. And archivists across America were absolutely outraged. And they all said, he's got to go to jail, he's got to go to jail. Half a dozen documents in his pocket, you do not steal from the National Archives. And the judge let him off with a slap on the wrist and a minor fine. And archivists were just outraged by that.
Does it matter if it's the importance of the document? I mean, they're not gonna turn over, I mean, when President Biden retires and is out of office, is he gonna hand over everything, or is it, or just the important stuff?
Oh, no, it's all government property. Now, there's a distinction between personal property and government property. But if it's a federal record, there is an archivist in the White House whose job is to take care of that.
And does that person decide, okay, this letter to whomever is not important, we don't need this? Or they're just gonna say, oh, no, copy it, record it?
Well, they keep the original.
Well, no, yeah.
But if it's a government record, if it were created as a function of the president doing the business of the office of the president, that document, that letter, that memo, that scribbling on a piece of paper of notes taken during a meeting, that is the property of the American people. The president does not belong to that, does not own that. You can't take it with them. It's the property of the American people. You know, the issue has also come up recently of someone reading a memo, tearing it up, putting it in the trash can, and then after he leaves the room, his staff going back and pulling those pieces of paper out of the trash can and taping them back together because that document so-and-so tore up was an official presidential record. You can't throw presidential records in a trash can. You can't tear up presidential records. And that's another crime, destroying government property, destroying presidential records. That's another crime to add to the list. So it's going to be an interesting time.
But do we have any other questions for Leon? Okay, well, thank you, Leon. We really appreciate your time.